Okay, well, I'm really excited to have you here. As some people might have seen in our stories and our most recent post, we started venturing into like I feel like we're growing up. We're like, okay, like people can hire us to share their information if we align with it. And the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices reached out to us and said that they had a report that normally is, they distribute it, but it's often within, I don't want to say an echo chamber, but like I feel like so many of these things they exist in their little spaces and they don't really get out to everybody in the way that we need this information to. So I was so pumped when you and the team reached out being like, could we do this together? Like, could we get this information out there? And I was like, oh my God, yes, I would love this because we need to talk more about the climate and the climate crisis we find ourselves in. So maybe I'll let you sort of introduce yourself and what the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices. I'm so sorry. I should have like looked that over 10 times before this, about what that is. And just to the question in the comment, we will save the live. Don't worry. But I hope you hang out.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. And I am so, so happy and grateful to be here. Honestly, I am just a fangirl. Like, I just love OnCanada Project. I've been following since early days when I was super anxious about the pandemic and I just like didn't know. I was like overwhelmed by information. I just thought the project did such a beautiful and engaging job in making public health specifically around the pandemic accessible. And so I was really excited to find a way to collaborate with OnCanada Project, especially as climate choices moved into this health space. And so we're going to talk a little bit about this report on the health costs of climate change. But all to say, was excited to find a way for OnCanada Project to be paid. So hire these folks if you can. A little bit about myself. My name is Kiemia. I use she and her or they pronouns. I am currently living on the territories of the Three Fires Confederacy, so the Ojibwe, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi, or what is currently known as Windsor, Ontario. And yeah, wear a lot of hats. I am mostly, though, driven by just love for people and for place and for justice and living happily and healthily. And that is, we can get more into it, but that's what eventually led me to climate choices and climate policy and feeling deeply concerned and deeply worried about the state of our planet and what the next 10 years of our lives as young people were going to look like. And so that's what made me want to get involved in climate policy. And so for the last year, I've been working at this organization, the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, which produces research on the best climate policy advice and recommendations, specifically based in what is currently Canada. And I've been working on engagement and communications, largely on youth engagement. So getting young people's input into what future they want to build, kind of what they want to see in the next 10 years, the decisions that they want to see, and also getting this information to young people who are just such amazing mobilizers and advocates and who can push governments and who can push bodies of people to make these changes that researchers and scientists and Indigenous knowledge holders and grassroots organizers have been talking about and advocating for decades.
I love that. And I think that's what made me really excited for this partnership. But I'll be honest, and I was saying this to you when we were chatting, I am probably not the greatest person when it comes to climate related topics. Like, I know something has to be done and I don't want to be embarrassed about it because I feel like there's a lot of people in that situation and I am open to learning, but I feel like I know we're in a climate crisis. I know something has to be done. But if I'm being totally honest, I think I spend a lot of time being like, what can I do? What can really be done? And like, it just feels so big that and I think that's always been my like discomfort with like stepping in fully to that space and understanding it is that kind of fear of it's too big. I'm never gonna be able to do anything about it. So like, let me just like avoid the topic, which I feel like is not great because we all have to know about it, to be able to advocate about it, to be able to vote around it. Like, so, I mean, is that like, have you always been very like
Mm.
climate forward, like ready to change things around this, or does this discomfort resonate with you? Did you at one point have that as well?
Yeah, no, thank you for that question. And I feel that deeply, the overwhelm and the anxiety. And the answer is no. I have not been for my whole life, like really
Okay.
like a person who saw myself represented in like nature or in environmental advocacy or action. Like I'm relatively new to this space too, but I think like yourself and like a lot of people our age, we grew up knowing that global warming was an issue and climate
Mm-hmm.
change was an issue. So this always existed, but my like where I saw myself and where I've always been justice driven, and I think that is rooted in being the child of a refugee and the child of a parent who lived through a war that was 10 years long, and appreciating my privilege here living safely, but also recognizing that not everybody, not many people had access to that kind of living. And so I was always very like human rights driven and justice driven. And that's where my concern was like refugee resettlement and migrant justice and racial justice. And climate change just never felt human enough for me. So for so
Mm-hmm.
long, I think environmental issues were painted as like very nature based, very species and animal based, which I think is really real and important. And I have come to really see that work as important again through the advocacy and knowledge of Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island who share this knowledge and are gracious to share this information, but it always felt like a really white space for me and not human grounded and not grounded in people's lives. And it wasn't until I started learning about Indigenous activists and land defenders and water defenders, mostly in Latin America, who were standing against extraction practices, mining, logging for their lands and protecting lands and waters and being violently harmed and attacked for doing this, that
Mm-hmm.
I realized, oh, climate change and environmental issues are justice issues. They're not just environmental issues. They have to do with people and they have to do with living. And they have to do with justice and rights. And so it was really that. It was the work of Indigenous land defenders, of Black folks, of people of color who have been talking about this that made me be able to see my place in climate action. And I don't know if now is the right time to get into it, but it was those feelings of finally seeing myself, but still not knowing where to start, that led to this project that I started with a group of young, mostly racialized folks, Indigenous, Black, racialized young people, called Letters to the Land, where we were all feeling this anxiety and this overwhelm and this like climate change is such a big issue, and we have been so disconnected from our ancestral teachings and our traditional knowledges because of displacement, because of migration. And we don't know where to start rebuilding these relationships to land and water that our ancestors have
Yeah.
held and we don't have access to anymore. And so we started this project called Letters to the Land, which was just all about moving into those feelings and rebuilding these relationships with one another. And so, if I would say anything to anyone who's feeling that overwhelm, I think what pushed me to finally feel landed in this climate policy space and feel like I had a place and I could do something about it was being in relationships with other people and feeling it with other people. And I think it's when you talk, like when you move into that anxiety and when you move into that grief and that fear, that there's a huge power in community in that and in not feeling alone and feeling like you're doing this with other people. And I don't think this work is ever sustainable if we're feeling the guilt of doing it alone and like feeling like, oh my God, every single purchase I make like can destroy the planet or save it. But rather is like, here are these group of people who care about this thing that I care about, and we are going to push for it, and we are going to do this in a fun way, in a way that is, makes me happy to be part of this group. And that's what sustains the energy of like, yes, we're all anxious and overwhelmed,
Mm-hmm.
and we love each other and this planet and this place enough to work together and move forward. So I just talked a lot. I
No,
hope that
I'm so
makes
moved by everything you said because I think like I also have so much, like I was saying, like discomfort around this topic of what has to be done and what can be done. And when I think I've always thought about it as like, what can I do? And then what can the government do? Like those are the two bodies. And like, or rather I should say like government as well as like corporations, like big things
right.
that feel like you can't really figure it out. My hands are moving so much. Sorry. But um, the like you can't really touch those things. I never really thought about it as like me and community, what can we do? Because that doesn't seem as overwhelming. I think when I, at least this past year of this project, it's so community driven that I feel not to be dramatic or like overextended, but like I think community can pretty much do anything. And there's such comfort in having people to work through these things with. So I like the idea of like exploring my discomfort in a space that is community driven and not isolating by myself and trying to like, yeah, and I think even the intersections that you sort of pointed out between you know, the climate crisis as well as health as well as like land justice and justice in general and the indigenous people of this land, like all of that stuff that ties together, it just makes it even more important to engage with and harder to like look away from in my mind now, because I don't think I saw myself in it in the same way that you were saying until that you sort of described it to me. um, so I guess leaning into this feeling of discomfort and trying to understand more, what is the, I guess like the report that the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices, like what are they doing, and why is that super important to for us to be paying attention to? Because I think as someone with like a health like
Mm-hmm.
undergrad and masters, I always engage in conversations around healthcare, um, but I don't think I've ever really like stopped to think of it in this way. So
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And I think what you yes, I want to get into the health report. And I think what is powerful about the work that the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices is doing and what policy work and policy kind of research and advocacy, the importance of that is we're not alone. It's not, we don't bear the brunt in our individual actions. There are these really important structures and policies and systems that governments need to be leading and governments need to be addressing so that we can meet our emissions targets and so that we can live in these sustainable and equitable ways. And so I think in my community organize coming from like a more of a grassroots space, I realized like, oh, like this is powerful, this is important, these relationships are important, and we need to get to decision makers. And there are a lot of different avenues to do that, which are all powerful, and climate policy making is one of them. And so that's, we talked a bit about what the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices does. And we recently released this report on the health costs of climate change. And what I think is so important about this report and about a lot of the reports that the Institute has been releasing is that we see that climate change is not just an environmental problem, and it's never just been an environmental problem. It's been a health issue. In this report, we see that climate change is a public health threat, but it's also a housing issue. It's also an education issue. It's also an access to social services and equity issue. And so what this report shows is as climate change worsens, as temperatures rise, as we face more and more unstable climate scenarios, more disasters due to climate change, higher temperatures, that has negative health outcomes. So people's physical health is at risk and people's mental and emotional well-being, which is also deeply important and deeply consequential. And so if we don't address healthcare and if we don't address like access to healthcare, people are going to be more at risk as the climate change situation worsens. And so there are policy actions that we can take right now so that people can adapt and can be ready for as the climate warms. Because
Mm-hmm.
while we need to be addressing mitigating emissions and taking emissions out of the atmosphere, we are also locked into a certain degree of climate change. And some of us may not be feeling that right now, but there are Indigenous communities in Canada and across the world. There are Black and racialized communities, and also other communities increasingly too, who have been already suffering and feeling the impacts of climate change. We can think of Inuit communities in the north, in the Arctic. We all saw the wildfires in Australia and the wildfires in the west coast of the US and Canada last year. These are things that are happening, and these are things that have direct impact on people's health. And so addressing healthcare and addressing these things that build strength and build resilience is how we can prepare to protect people's health and stay healthy as we face these outcomes more and more in the coming years.
Yeah, so I think that was what made me so interested in this report when we sat down and chatted for the first time. Was that the entire report is about this, and we've
Yeah.
sort of like what the OnCanada Project will be doing over the next couple weeks is taking that report and putting it in sort of bite-sized packages, I guess, that we can share on our grid and invite more people into this conversation of understanding. So even if the report in its full length is a little daunting to read, there'll be like these kind of like short form things that you can go through and look at that that sort of capture it. One of which is like I think the first post is already on our grid about climate change and health. Like, what is the relationship even?
Yeah.
Which is really a great place to start. But so I guess maybe what we can like talk like, do you want to talk a little bit about that? About what is the like, what are the like what's happening up north and what's been going on with these with wildfires and stuff that like, and what like what's the, I feel like there's like a part of that sentence that's left out because I don't see the like, I kind of see the line with what is impacting health, but I don't see it like directly. Is it just like
Yeah.
the air quality and like that effect on health? Is it land is or ice is melting, so livelihoods up north are, and like way of being is just like changing? What's the rest of that sentence, I guess?
Yeah, so it's very multifaceted, exactly like you said. Rising temperatures have a direct impact on air quality, and emissions have a direct impact on air quality. And so those things impact like people's breathing abilities. And we're talking about communities in the north. Rising temperatures and melting ice is, yes, affecting livelihood, is affecting terrains that for thousands of years communities were identified with and were able to seek their food sources on. Those, that ice is melting, and so folks are not able to connect with both the food security, their food sources, as well as cultural practices and traditions that have defined a people for thousands and thousands of years. And so that we're talking about these physical health impacts, but also there are these mental and emotional health impacts as we lose things that we've identified with, and we lose our connections to place, and we lose our our relationships with one another and in community as these places that we love are lost. And those are these intangible impacts that, where the cost of climate change report breaks down the cost to government as more and more people have to receive health care because of the impacts of climate change. It's much harder to put a monetary cost on identity shifting and on emotional and spiritual well-being. We can't put a financial cost on that, but that is deeply important. And what I think is really what's really important that this report takes away, what this report underlines, is that we have to address both the symptoms and the root causes of climate change and of climate change health impacts. So as temperatures warm, let's say a symptom is going to be folks who are unhoused, folks who don't have houses are going to be directly outside and are going to directly be suffering from increased heat temperatures. And so we need cooling stations so that people can go and not be affected by heat exhaustion and not have those health impacts. But also we need to address the issue of housing so that people are not unhoused. There are these root causes like access to housing, like access to healthcare, like food security that are disproportionately impact racialized folks, indigenous folks, Black folks, because of historically discriminatory policies. And so not only are indigenous, Black, racialized folks living in these areas that are on the front lines of climate change, areas that don't have the adequate infrastructure to stay resilient while temperatures rise and while these health outcomes show up, but also these folks have increased barriers within the healthcare system and increased barriers to having those supports and strengths that we need to adapt to climate change. So addressing climate change, addressing this issue is not just addressing the environment, but it's addressing these root causes of access to education, of access to employment, of income, equitable income. And it's those root causes that are going to keep people resilient as the climate changes. And so to do that, we have to address the discrimination and the racism and these systems that have left certain communities more vulnerable than others because of the history of this place where we live.
That is so powerful. I feel kind of fired up and angry. Just because these are a lot of the things. I guess I've always thought of it as like what can be done, and then I get overwhelmed. But what I'm hearing is there's actually like a lot to be done.
Yeah.
A lot of which would have immediate results in supporting and protecting people, even if, like you were saying, we're locked into certain temperatures. But there's work to be done immediately to support and protect and care for people. And that just makes me feel like, why aren't we doing it? Why aren't we doing it? And why isn't that done? Why isn't that like the easiest thing to address of like, what we need to do? We need to protect people.
Totally. And I hope that's what people can take away from this is you don't have to be in a climate space to address climate change. Addressing climate change means addressing these root causes of inequity in our communities. So that in your workplace can look like creating more positions and more space for Indigenous folks in positions of leadership. That's encouraging and supporting land defenders. And that's organizing around climate policy and listening to these recommendations and research that comes from places like the Canadian Institute for Climate Choices that show so many different options and so many different solutions that we have available right now that we can push for and we can implement to be resilient and also to address climate change as it addresses. So I really hope what people are able to take away is that everyone does have a place in this, and that place can just come through your work and your increasing addressing equity and addressing access to social and economic supports within whatever space that you're in.
That like leaves me with chills. I feel like there's work to be done, and that makes me feel like I can advocate on those things. When I email not that my MVP responds to my emails in a timely fashion, but I could be adding in conversations about this when I'm reaching out. I could be paying more attention to these, what I would have thought is like, not a, like I guess when when a platform comes out for elections and stuff like that, it's like very like I look at like, what are you doing about like emissions and what are you doing about this and but I don't really look at what are you doing to protect people as it relates to climate change, and what are you doing to create opportunities for racialized people to like be supported. And have work and be fulfilled and safe. And yeah, I think there's so much more to, such a different lens that can be taken when looking into all of this stuff that I don't think I would have thought about without this conversation or this report. So I think that's really important. We try to keep our lives about 30 minutes. So I'm noticing that we've got about 4 minutes left. What do you think is the most important component of the report in, like, for someone like who would see it from this account? So like you're not from like the people that might be sent the report to get to look at it, but for like everyday folk like ourselves, like me, what is like the TLDR of what I should take away and mobilize around, I guess.
Yeah. I think the TLDR is climate change is not just an environmental issue, it's a public health issue, it's an economic issue. And so we need to address being a public health issue, we need to address the this structural determinants of our health and the structural determinants that impact our access to
Mm-hmm.
living as healthy people in society. And so addressing those root causes, I think, is such an important takeaway from this report, and seeing climate change in this integrated way so that, like you said, our leaders and our politicians are talking about climate change as a bigger issue and not just an environmental issue. So I think that's the biggest takeaway, and to do this work with others and to not feel alone and to know that there are solutions. There are so many solutions, and we just need to push to get action on them. But if you engage with Climate Trace's work and if you engage with a lot of different research organizations, you'll see we have a lot of answers, and it's not just overwhelming. And so acting on these answers can get us to the healthier place that we want to be.
Well, I love that. Thank you so much for stopping by to chat about this. And I'm excited for the rest of these posts to come out and to learn and to find my community and do the work, because I think this is so necessary. And I'm really excited that we got to chat about it.
Yeah, thank you, Sam. I'm really excited too. I'm so grateful to you. I'm so grateful to your work, and so grateful to everyone who tuned in and who will watch this. I hope you see yourself reflected in this space, and I'm just grateful to all be on this work in this journey together. So thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for watching. We'll see you at the next live. Thanks so much, guys. Bye.
Bye.